everyone. Welcome back to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that this past week I got Invisalign. So far, it has changed the way that I talk. It sounds like I'm talking with a lisp. Sometimes it sounds like I'm talking with a lisp. It definitely makes my mouth drier, so I'll need to take more drinks of water during my recordings. The dentist who that feels like installed my Invisalign on my teeth. That's probably not the accurate word. She said that most likely I will adjust. She said approximately 6 weeks is what most people take to adjust to Invisalign. I hope that's the case. I can't imagine adjusting and adapting, but I hope that I'll have them on for about a year, she said. And you may notice a difference in how I'm talking and how I sound. So in today's episode, I'll be talking about the roles we inherit in our families. The ones we never chose, the ones we didn't know we were playing, and the ones we often still carry into adulthood. While many of us grew up in a family, we also grew up in a system. And systems, especially dysfunctional ones, assign roles, and those roles become rigidly fixed. These systems do not assign the roles out loud. They may not ever be verbalized. They may not be intentional. But people learn the roles that they play through behavior, silence, emotion, and the need to survive. Some of the roles you may have heard include the hero, the scapegoat or the black sheep, the lost child or invisible, the caretaker or parentified child, and the mascot. Today, I want to talk about why these roles form, what they give us, what they cost us, how they show up in our adult relationships, and what it looks like to move into functional adulthood, where we're no longer defined by the role we had to play at age 7 or 12 or 17 years old. I'm also going to weave in something that I've been teaching in my Beyond Words couples workshop, the child self, the adaptive self, and the functional adult self. In the episode today, we're also going to go deeper, not just what these roles are, but actually how they form, why they vary from child to child, and how the child self, the adaptive child self, and the functional adult self each play a part. These three selves explain exactly how and why family roles get created, and more importantly, how we heal them. I'm also going to fold in something that Gabor Mate teaches, because I think it changes everything that we understand about family systems. And that's that every child has different parents. Even in the same family, each child grows up with a different version of mom and dad. It explains why siblings remember the same childhood differently and why they adopt different roles. I'll share a bit of my own family story as we go. Growing up as one of 6 children, I was number 2, and how the parents I had were not the same parents my youngest 2 siblings had. So let's get into it. Before we talk about roles, we need to set the foundation with the 3 selves that shape them. Let's start off with the child self. This part of you is open, curious, sensitive, emotionally honest, and longing for connection and safety. Every child leads with the child self because that is our most authentic, unguarded state. But when the environment makes that unsafe, the adaptive child self emerges. And the seeds for this begin early, between ages 2 and 6. During these years, kids start to notice parental mood shifts, conflict in the family, inconsistency, withdrawal. They can start to feel and absorb shame. They may feel angry. And they have a sense of family instability. So they begin experimenting with strategies to stay attached, because attachment is survival. This is where the earliest roots of pleasing, performing, disappearing, distracting, and caretaking start to show up. It's not a full adaptive self yet, but the template is being developed. And this is where family roles begin. The adaptive self tends to solidify between the ages of 7 and 12 years old. By this stage, the child has a clearer sense of roles. They understand what behaviors are safe or unsafe in the family. They know the spoken and the unspoken rules of the family. And they're tracking emotional patterns. This is when the adaptive self locks in and becomes the child's primary operating system. It becomes the identity that they take into school, friendships, early accomplishments, and their early self-image. It's why many adults say things like, "I've always been the responsible one," or "I've always been the one who disappears." They were not born that way. Instead, it was learned and cemented during this window of time. Between the ages of 12 to 18 years old, the adaptive child becomes the boss. Adolescence is where the adaptive self becomes most dominant. Teenagers don't have enough access to functional adult skills yet, or the ability to be a functional adult, but they're no longer younger children either. So the adaptive child self becomes a protector, a strategist. They have armor. It's an identity manager and an emotion regulator. It's why adolescence often intensifies perfectionism, rebellion, caretaking, avoidance, invisibility, humor as a defense, conflict patterns, and shame responses. Teens are also trying to keep attachment while managing increasing emotional complexity. The adaptive self steps in hard during these years. And by adulthood, the adaptive self often runs the entire system, unless someone has secure attachment offered to them, emotionally mature caregivers, somebody who repairs and models emotional regulation. They may be taught boundaries, and they may feel a sense of safety and have appropriate expectations placed on them. The adaptive child self becomes the person's default identity moving into adulthood. And it shows up in their intimate relationships, their conflict patterns, their work identity, their parenting, the roles that they play in groups, and how they respond to stress. Even highly successful adults can still be operating mostly from the adaptive child self if they've never done deeper work. So to summarize these adaptive selves, they start forming in the years between 2 and 6 years old. They hardwire and take over between 7 and 12 years old. And they fully run emotional survival strategies between 12 to 18 years old. It also becomes the unconscious identity in adulthood unless there's therapy, recovery, or secure attachment that reshapes it. The work of healing is moving from the adaptive child self into the functional adult self without abandoning the child self. So let's talk about the functional adult self. But I need a drink. This is the healthiest version of you. This self feels feelings without being overwhelmed, can set boundaries, takes accountability, repairs rupture, communicates honestly, tolerates discomfort, can handle conflict, makes choices aligned with values. This self can ask for help, admit mistakes, accept influence, and they don't define themselves by childhood roles. This episode is ultimately about moving from adaptive child to functional adult. And to do that, we need to name the roles. Family roles form because children adapt to the emotional climate of the home. And as I've said previously, each child is adapting to a different emotional climate. Let me share a personal example to bring this alive. I'm number two of six children. And the mom that I had was emotionally, developmentally, and circumstantially not the same mom that my two youngest siblings had. When I was growing up, there was conflict between my parents, a lot. I remember conflict going back to when I was 3 years old and have had that confirmed that yes, there was a lot of conflict in my parents' marriage when I was three. So there was conflict, there was tension in their marriage, there was financial instability. And I was a lot older when the divorce finally happened. I don't know if I've said this before, but my older sister was living in Arizona when we talked to my mom about getting a divorce. So it would have been me and the two brothers under me that talked to her about needing a divorce. I remember she told us that she was staying married until the youngest two were in high school or were 18 years old. And we told her that she was not doing them any favors, that things were escalating and only getting worse. I don't remember the time frame between when we had that conversation with her and she had the conversation with my dad about separating. Initially, they separated, and that was planned to be for a year because she felt that it would go better if my dad thought that he thought that it wasn't final. That year of separation would also give my mom a chance to financially and in other ways prepare for the divorce. At that time, leading up to my mom asking my dad for a separation, I was in the process of getting married, which was not fun to be planning to get married while navigating and helping my mom plan to get divorced. When my husband and I got back from our honeymoon, my mom approached my dad and asked him for a divorce. We would talk to my oldest sibling on the phone about this, so she was aware and supportive of what we were helping mom to accomplish. And we were talking to my mom, but there were conversations that just the three of us had. We were worried about what would happen, how my dad would react when my mom asked him for a divorce. My dad wasn't necessarily big into hunting or guns or anything like that, but he did have them. And so before my husband and I got married and left on our honeymoon, we had removed all the guns from the home just as a precautionary so that if he responded very poorly, guns were not easily accessible and in the house. I think we had moved them into our apartment before getting married and going away. Ultimately, the conversation my mom had with my dad about getting divorced was pretty uneventful. He didn't push, he didn't argue much, and he agreed to move out. We were in a different room listening and making sure everything was okay. And I remember him asking, it may not have been in that first conversation, but between that conversation of them separating and him moving out, I remember overhearing a conversation between my mom and dad where my dad made a comment, something about not seeing the kids as much. And my mom said, well, you don't really see the kids now. She said, you often leave early in the morning, and by the time you get home, they're in bed. You can go days or a week without actually seeing and interacting with the kids. And his response was that I like the idea that they're there. And I remember thinking, that's such a weird comment. He likes the idea that we exist, that we're there, even though he may not see or interact with us for a week or many days in a row. There were times when I was an older teen. My parents were not staying in the same bedroom at that point. My dad was not living in the basement, but that's where he slept. My dad was just not home enough to be living in the basement. But I remember as a teenager, I was staying up late and I was watching TV down in the basement on the basement TV. And my dad got home and came downstairs, and I knew he would want to watch TV. Typically at that time, if my dad walked into a room, I walked out. It was not comfortable for me to be in the same room as him. And this wasn't just one memory. I have a scattering of these memories happening multiple times where I'd be sitting on the couch watching TV. He'd come downstairs, sit down on the other side of the couch, maybe say hi, probably not every time even saying anything. And then I would get up and leave and go to my bedroom. And as I was walking out of the room, he would lean over and grab the remote and change the channel. It wasn't like when I got up to leave, he didn't say, "Oh, hey, where are you going?" or, "Oh, you don't have to leave." I think he wanted me to leave. So my younger two siblings at this time were, I think, 10. Let me do the math real quick. So my youngest sister would have been 11, I think, when my dad moved out. And then my youngest sibling, my brother, would have been, I think he's 3 years younger than her. So he would have been 8. Most of their growing up happened post-divorce. So there wasn't a lot of fighting between mom and dad anymore. There was still financial stress because my dad didn't pay child support. But the emotional tone of the house was different. My mom had more bandwidth. She had more clarity. And she had more emotional room for the two of them. She invested in them differently and supported them differently. Maybe not always in a healthy way. I think she lived through them. They gave her a lot of self-esteem and purpose. Both of my younger sister and younger brother were able to play competitive sports, something the older four of us just didn't have the resources for. It wasn't really an option. My younger brother and sister didn't work until after high school. I started working at age 12, making and selling homemade bread. And the brother right under me started working at 11 years old on a nearby farm. The brother under him, I think would have been similar age, worked at the same farm. And I don't know that it was necessarily because of favoritism, although I do think my mom had favorites. I think it was more about timing. Different kids experience different parents. And because of that, each of us developed different adaptive child strategies and different roles in the family. So let's name the roles and talk about each one. Starting with the hero. The hero child is the child who tries to save the family by being exceptional. The hero role is often gendered. Families often unconsciously shape the hero child differently depending on whether the child is a daughter or a son. So hero daughters often become emotional caregivers, second mothers, academic high achievers, peacemakers. They tend to be perfectionists, and they're responsible beyond their years. Hero sons may have some of those same qualities. They often become achievers, protectors. They excel in athletics. They're the family's pride, the one who carries the family name. And they tend to be the symbol of hope and potential. Same role, but a different shape. And understanding this matters because it helps explain why siblings can both be heroes, but often in different ways. So a daughter may be the emotional hero who stabilizes the family and caretakes, and a son may be the achievement hero, athletically and academically. The hero role isn't always gendered, but it definitely can be. So how does this show up in adult relationships? Heroes often take on too much. They attract partners who are less functioning than they are, not necessarily that they're not functional, just that the hero is over functioning. They can become emotional parents to their spouse. They often shut down when they can't solve something. They feel responsible for their partner's emotions. They struggle with vulnerability and have the belief that they need to earn their worth. The hero's child self wanted acceptance, as all children do. The adaptive child believed acceptance came through their performance. And in order to heal, the functional adult self has to learn they can rest without losing love. They can fail and make mistakes and still be worthy. That they don't have to fix everything, and that they can let people help them. There's another family role, the golden child. And I want to say the hero child and the golden child are not always the same role. The golden child often protects the parent's ego. They're idealized. They cannot fail. They're compared to other siblings, with the golden child often coming out on top. And they're used as proof that the parent is good. They often absorb identity. Whereas the hero child protects the family system, overfunctions, stabilizes the family system. They absorb and take on the responsibility in the family, and they prevent emotional collapse. The hero carries the burden, but often the golden child carries the fantasy of the family. Sometimes one child is both. In other families, one child is the hero and another child is the golden child. If you had a brother who was idealized or symbolically elevated, while you as a daughter carried more responsibility and caretaking, you'll immediately recognize this dynamic. The next role is the scapegoat or the black sheep. The scapegoat often becomes the identified problem in the family, and there is a benefit to the role of scapegoat. Often the scapegoat is the one who's emotionally honest. They have the freedom to tell the truth. They may have a strong sense of injustice, and they're typically more independent. But this role also costs the individual because typically they're being blamed for all of the problems of the family. They've internalized shame, often feeling misunderstood. They carry labels of difficult, dramatic, or rebellious. And they believe they're the problem, and they've learned to not trust any authority. For their adult relationship patterns, scapegoats often choose partners who reenact shame. They sabotage closeness because they expect rejection. They carry the family secrets, and they may oscillate between rebellion and withdrawal. They mistake chaos for connection, and they believe they're too much. The scapegoat's child self wanted safety and truth. The adaptive child took blame in order to keep the peace. And for healing, the functional adult self has to learn, I'm not the family sin eater, that my truth is valid, and that I don't have to be the one who carries the shame of the family. The next role is the lost child, or the invisible child. This child disappears into the background. The benefit of being the lost child is they're not involved in conflict. There's emotional anonymity, which allows them to have a sense of independence, and they oftentimes avoid shame. But the cost of being the lost child is an emotional numbness. They often have difficulty expressing needs. There's identity confusion because identity never really formed. There's an internal loneliness, and they're prone to dissociation. As adults, lost children often leave when relationships get close. They fold under pressure. They prefer isolation. They may feel like a burden, and they often struggle to articulate their needs. Some children become lost children because at their stage of development, the parent was emotionally depleted. They disappeared because disappearing worked. Their child self wanted peace. The adaptive child created invisibility. And for healing, the functional adult needs to learn that they can take up space, that they can be known, and they can ask for what they need and want. Another role you may have heard of is the mascot or the jokester. The mascot becomes the emotional regulator in the family. The benefit of the mascot is they can create laughter. They provide emotional relief. They develop very good social skills. And they're often charming. But the cost is they have avoided vulnerability. Their emotions are stored underground. They're often taken much less seriously, and they struggle with intimacy. As adults, mascots often use humor to deflect pain. They may not have a solid sense of self. They become the fun one at the expense of depth. And they often feel responsible for others' discomfort. Their child self wanted connection. The adaptive child made it through humor. And for healing, the functional adult has to learn that they're allowed to feel very deeply and that they don't have to perform to be loved. And the last role that I'm going to talk about is the caretaker or the parentified child. The caretaker had to grow up too soon. They benefit from feeling needed. There's a temporary stability that they can provide. And they often have a sense of purpose, even if it's not rooted in who they actually are. The cost for caretakers is chronic exhaustion. There may be some underlying resentment. They experience anxiety. They too are over-functioning, and they experience any guilt if they prioritize themselves. They may end up being attracted to emotionally immature partners as a way of also caretaking and parenting them. As adults, they tend to become therapists in their relationships, whether they do professionally or not. They tend to fix things instead of letting themselves feel things. They continue to override their own needs and wants, and they may become resentful, but they can't stop rescuing others. Their child self wanted stability. The adaptive child created competence. And for healing, the functional adult self has to learn that they're allowed to receive and that they're not responsible for everyone's emotional state. We know that caretakers often fall disproportionately on daughters, especially if the mother was overwhelmed during that child's early years. But let's talk about how family roles work in healthy families or adaptive and differentiated families. There's a big difference. In dysfunctional families, these roles are assigned and they're very rigid. But in healthy families, the roles are flexible and they're shared. Healthy families allow every family member to be funny, to be sad, to shine, to make mistakes, to be quiet, to be brave, to repair, to step out front and lead, to follow, and to rest. In healthy family systems, nobody gets stuck in a role. No one becomes the problem, and no one loses emotional access to themselves. You can often tell a healthy family by its flexibility, the emotional safety, their ability to repair. They tend to operate with healthy boundaries. There's permission for individuality. They navigate the truth. There's shared responsibility, and there's a secure connection among family members. Now, you may be wondering, is there common pairings in these family roles and adult relationships? There is some that we know. Heroes tend to pair with a lost child. Caretakers often pair with scapegoats. And mascots often pair with heroes. In their adult relationships, these roles often interact like old choreography, with heroes over functioning, lost children under communicating, scapegoats reacting, caretakers rescuing, and mascots distracting. Often the hero child grows up to marry someone who unconsciously expects them to continue being the responsible one. Now, I've worked with couples where the partner of the hero child would say, I don't expect them to continue to be the responsible one. I just do responsibility different. And that may be very true. The hero child may struggle to see that, however. And the golden child often struggles with accountability because they weren't required to develop it. Healing whatever role that was assigned to you in your family of origin is about reclaiming yourself. It requires awareness, compassion, allowing the child self to speak and be known. It also requires understanding the adaptive child's logic in order to shift it into functional adult behavior. If this is some work that you want to be doing or you're currently doing, it can be helpful to identify the role you played, give yourself some examples of this happening, notice how it shows up today, also with some examples you can put your finger on. Practice doing the opposite in small ways. Another thing I want to say about healthy family systems is none of the roles, because they're not fixed and they're not rigid, none of the roles become that extreme. So when I say practice doing it the opposite, it's going to be in small ways, not necessarily becoming rebellious like the scapegoat, but being able to say no, or I don't like that. If you tend to be the scapegoat, it may look like looking for ways to get on board and to say, yeah, I want to be part of this. Allow yourself to fail in ways that actually aren't failing. They're just letting yourself be imperfect, as all humans are. Some of the practices may include letting someone help you. I remember when I was in therapy, one of the times I had a couple of kids at the time, and my therapist had said, I think you need to ask help from others. And at that time, I had a hard time struggling what I would need help with. I don't remember what stage this was, but I remember the house we lived in at the time, and all of my kids were born in that house. So I would have definitely had 3, possibly 4. And I would ask my husband to help me. I relied on him to help me. But outside of that, that was difficult. And my therapist suggested, why don't you borrow something from a neighbor? And I remember saying, well, I don't really need anything. I have it. I've talked before about my food storage issues. I typically was the one, of course, you can probably guess the role that I played in my family if you've listened to this podcast for a while or by what I'm about to share. But I had things, I had storage. Eventually, it became a bigger issue in the next house where we had an actual room for food storage. My brothers, when they discovered it, called it our mini store, which it was. My kids talk about how they didn't realize not every family had a store in their basement, but ours did. And I often, it was fully stocked with anything that I might need. So this is back a house though, when this happened, and my therapist was asking me, why don't you ask your neighbor for something? And I had said, I don't need anything. I have everything. I have extra. I have backup. And my therapist said, okay, but that's not the point. The point is you're learning to ask for help. So I ended up asking my neighbor if I could borrow a cup of sugar. And she said yes. And I went over to get it. And I said, I'll bring it back as soon as I get some. And she was like, do not bring me back a cup of sugar. I have sugar. I'm not going to miss a cup of sugar. You're fine. Which, helped me to see that, okay, yeah, asking for something didn't mean I owed them, that maybe there were other functional people as well. Of you may need to start a practice of sharing your feelings honestly and learning how to stay present when you want to disappear. In the group that I co-facilitate and have for years, we had talked about at one point emotionally flashing back, which is similar to a PTSD flashback, except in a PTSD flashback. So we started to identify these in the field after the Vietnam War. So I'll often use that as an example and say veterans from the Vietnam War were back in the United States. They were living at home. They were functioning in the town that they usually grew up in. But the trigger may be a car backfiring. It may be going to an Asian restaurant and hearing familiar sounds, smelling familiar smells. And those triggers often transported them back as though they were back in the jungles of Vietnam instead of a restaurant in the United States. And they have a reaction as though they're back under threat in Vietnam. Pete Walker talks about emotional flashbacks, and they're a little bit different in that we flash back to the past, similar to a PTSD flashback, but often the interpretation we make is that it's happening in our present life. So we fill in the blanks, we make meaning out of it as though it's happening to me on this day at this time or within the last week or something, when in reality, I may have flashed back to another emotional phase of my life. I may be 10 years old, I may be 6 years old. So we had talked about that several years ago in group. And the language that it's become known now is if we're in group and somebody has an emotional flashback, they'll often say, oh, I think I just time traveled. Or they may say, oh, I am time traveling right now, which is accepted. We know what that means. They can share those feelings honestly. They can share what's happening with them honestly. And often that helps re-anchor them back into the present instead of disappearing into the emotional flashback. It may be helpful to reflect on which role you played growing up. What does it look like today? How are you playing it now? And what would it look like for you to step into your functional adult self? What would need to change? And exploring what role do you wish you had access to in your family of origin? And what would that look like? And what would that look like in your life today? Healing from family roles is not about waking up one day and announcing to your parents and siblings, I'm different now. That's not how it works, and that would not go well. In fact, the family of origin is the hardest, most rigid, and least receptive place to begin practicing new roles. These roles were established early. They were reinforced thousands of times. And everyone in the system has benefited from you staying exactly the way you are, regardless of what role you were assigned. Whether that's the hero being responsible, the scapegoat being the problem. Nobody wants to change seats with the scapegoat. It might be the lost child disappearing and the mascot smoothing tension, or the caretaker carrying too much. And when you start showing up differently in your family of origin, the old system will almost always try to snap you back into place. And it is really hard to be around your family of origin and not get sucked right back into the role that you always played. I tell my clients all the time, your family of origin is the last place to practice changing your role. And it certainly can't be the first. Where healing actually begins is in the places where your adult self has more space to grow and to be seen. The relationships that don't require you to reenact your childhood survival patterns. With the people who don't depend on you playing those roles. With the people, so that might start in your marriage. Talking to your partner about what you're learning and the ways that you want to grow, and letting your partner help you. That might include you learning how to share the emotional labor you've been carrying. Now, if you're the hero or the golden child, that can be hard to do because your partner may not do it as well as you've always done it. And it's not about your partner replacing the role that you played or engaging in a way where they are partnering with you to perform the role that you were assigned. It's learning that you don't have to. Instead, it's learning to overfunction. That your partner might have their own way of doing things, and that's okay. We may have to learn to resist the urge to fix and overfunction. And it's letting yourself be seen, not be invisible, letting yourself have depth, not just being strong. You can also start to practice this with your kids. You can model boundaries and repair. Show them honesty instead of perfection. And allow them to see what a functional adult looks like. One who can feel, who makes mistakes, and who can still stay connected. You can also practice this with friends. Allow yourself to take up space. If you've always been the listener or the helper. Or slow down and let yourself receive if you've always been the rescuer. A common place where these family of origin rules and roles get replicated is in the workplace, which makes sense because there's a natural hierarchy at work, making it so tempting to replay family of origin dynamics, except everybody at work doesn't have the same family of origin. So at work, you may let yourself belong to the team and function as one member of the team. Letting yourself say no, asking for help, and to stop absorbing everyone's emotional emergencies. These are places where your functional adult self gets to take the lead, where you try on new identities, and where you practice showing up outside of your childhood script. After enough practice, slowly, gently, you can begin bringing that self back into your family of origin. Not to change them, but to stop abandoning yourself in order to maintain your old role. I realize we're coming up on the holidays, and so I want to say a note about the holidays. The holidays activate family of origin roles more intensely than any other time of the year. The hero starts doing everything. The scapegoat braces for criticism. The lost child retreats into invisibility. The mascot tries to make everyone happy, and the caretaker ends up exhausted. So here's what healing can look like during this season. And knowing that the holidays are just right upon us, take maybe one thing that you can try to change and work on the rest in the next year. So one of the things that you can do during the holiday season is lower the bar. You're not going home to try to transform your family. You're going home to try to stay connected to your functional adult self. And that's going to take a lot of work. So pick one thing you want to do differently. Just one. That may be saying no to a request. It may look like going on a walk when someone raises their voice. You might need to leave early. It might look like not jumping in to fix everything and managing the emotional landscape during the holidays. It also may look like letting someone else manage the crisis, which I know what you're thinking. If I don't handle the crisis, nobody's going to handle the crisis. And maybe that's okay. Let yourself get curious, watch, see what happens, notice the tugs from your adaptive self, and see what you can learn by just paying attention. Like I said, we're not trying to change your entire family system, but small steps can change the entire system inside of you. It's also helpful to know your early warning signs. When the adaptive child self comes online, you might feel smaller. You might feel responsible. You might feel ashamed. You might become hyper alert and disconnected from your adult voice. Naming this, being aware when it starts to happen, and be able to put words to it can help your functional adult step back in. It's also important to bookend any time with family with others. It's all about creating a support plan that's available to you who is aware and understands what typically happens for you. It might be a friend or your partner who can send you a text during the family gathering. It might be a sponsor or a group member that you can text and say, I'm feeling the pull to move back into my old self again. I've had clients who bookend a family gathering by saying, okay, I'm going to go. Here's the plan, and I'll text you on the other side. This interrupts the old neural pathway. I want to also talk about giving yourself permission to leave, because this seems to be hard for a lot of people, where somehow they feel like they have to be held hostage to the family's timetable, or maybe it's mom's timetable. Maybe they hate being the first one to leave, even though they hate being the last one to leave. The reminder that I often offer to clients, and sometimes myself, is you don't get awards for enduring more than your nervous system can bear. In fact, often that's when things go off the road and we end up in the weeds, regretting what happens next. And then lastly, remember that your family may never see the new you. And that's okay. You can't make them. But you're also not doing this for them. You're doing this for you, for your family, for your spouse, for your kids. You're doing this for the child that you once were, as well as the adult that you're becoming. Healing is not fast, and it is never perfect. What healing does require is noticing your role in real time, choosing differently in small increments, practicing your adult self in safer relationships, and honoring your child self without letting the adaptive child self drive the bus. It's letting yourself grow slowly and building the life and identity that you never had room for. Remember, every time you step outside your childhood script, even for a moment or an hour, you're choosing the person that your childhood never imagined you could become. So don't start with the biggest trigger. Don't walk into Thanksgiving dinner trying to reinvent yourself. That's too much weight to put on the most fragile part of your healing. Remember to build those emotional muscles elsewhere. And then you bring strength back to your family of origin interactions. I also want to normalize that there is a grieving process involved. One of the greatest sorrows that I learned as I went through some of this grieving process, and I'll probably always go through this grieving process, is I can't make the family that I so desperately wanted to grow up in. I don't get to control everyone else. Everything you did to survive was ingenious. The roles you played, the masks you wore, the versions of yourself that you learned to be. But the person you become when you heal is intentional. You can honor the child you were without living the life that they had to create. Your childhood story is not your identity. It's simply the beginning of your becoming. And at the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.